Tonight on the Roscoe Palm show, we have former South African ambassador to the US, Ebrahim Rasool, live in studio. When two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. Commuters, the working class, once again, the human shield, the collateral damage as the taxi strike roils on. Meanwhile, the ECOWAS deadline has passed for Niger to restore the former president. What's behind the spate of coups in West Africa? Is it a factor that France has the fourth largest gold reserves in the world, but not a single gold mine? Further afield, the Lady R inquiry completed as, surprise, surprise, no weapons were loaded onto the Russian ship. What now for US-South Africa relations and Ambassador Brigety? Remember, he bet his life on it. Finally, Donald Trump indicted once again. He says he is now one indictment away from becoming US president again. All this and more on the Roscoe Palm show, but first, this.
Cheers! Well, don't get too excited yet. I think we're going to win this one, JB!
Go, go, go! All right!
That is MACO member for Safety and Security, JP Smith, lekker dicing from 4 years ago.
Go, go, go! All right!
Go, go, go! All right! Nantel. So obviously the big JP Smith story is not his magnetic charisma on camera. It's the taxi stayaway or taxi strike.
It's one of those going through TikTok today early on. It gives me pre-94 vibes. And I'm not just saying that willy-nilly. It's seeing people walk home from town. It's whoever's responsible. This is something else. This is not a working community. This is not a working society. This is not the best run city. If you're claiming that, this is definitely not it.
So I just wanted to ask Nantel Hopley, co-piloting me, how did you get to work today in light of the taxi strike?
I'm fortunate enough. I just opened two doors and I'm at home. I'm at work.
So I'm with the former Premier of the Western Cape and former South African Ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool. How was your day today?
Oh, it was a busy day, but it's good to be here. This is a lovely end to the day. I know you're going to be challenging me, but I think my brain has been prepared by the Minister of International Relations that I had my first meeting with, the UWC Council that I spent the afternoon with. And so all in all, I think they have been the warm-ups.
The warm-ups.
For the Roscoe Palm show.
Thank you so much. You honor me. I think, that you are one of the best diplomats that South Africa has ever seen. So I don't know whether to take that especially seriously. How much should I...
No, Secretary Albright, Madeleine Albright once asked me, what is your definition of diplomacy? I said, it's the art of telling the truth gently. You must never deviate from the truth, but you must tell it gently. Because the person you're telling it to is not your enemy. You're trying to change behavior, not throw away the person. So you can take it. When I say that I was in trepidation for your show, that I mean it because I think there's some weighty issues that you are planning to discuss.
But thank you for coming here today. Of course, the big topic of last week was Julius Malema, and that sort of disappeared in the rearview mirror. Something that was kind of very theoretical and philosophical, as the issue that we are now facing is one of the material. People are being affected by the taxi strike. What's your take on what's happened so far?
Look, I think that we now know that we're in the midst of an election. The first announcement that we're in the midst of an election was comical. It was Julius Malema provocatively and deliberately chanting something that he knew would dominate the headlines and the airways. He knew it would. He would be the topic of conversation. For a week, he needn't pay a single advert's money. he would rile the usual suspects. They would threaten all kinds of things. And so Julius Malema has achieved his purpose. He's in the headlines, he's in the public space, and he's speaking to a voter base that he knew was diminishing. But his opponents took themselves so seriously by taking Julius Malema so seriously and walked right into his trap and made sure that Julius Malema's election campaign had kicked off in the most outrageous way, the most provocative way, sometimes even the most vile way, because the merits of chanting, kill the boer, kill the farmer, that's moot. It is the performative. It is the idea of choreographing an outrage.
A theater of politics.
A theater of politics. And so I don't know who's more stupid. The one who chanted it or the others who rose to the challenge to also mobilize their base. Look how well we are protecting you. And they give themselves away. Who's their base? Who is this boers and farmers that you're going to protect? And at the expense of who? So that was the one thing in which the election campaign kicked off comically, but it also kicked off tragically. And I'll come to that point. The taxi violence, the standoff, unfortunately, it's orchestrated to kick off an election campaign. It's the politics of the dog whistle. Look how tough we are on lawlessness and impunity.
So you're saying that the law and order of the city of Cape Town, dog whistling to a certain cohort, is the spark that lit the fire of this violence?
I think there's nothing more than that. I think it was the kickoff of another election campaign that said to particularly minority communities, those who like law and order, those who are tired of taxis and the menace they produce on the road, the lawlessness they represent, the red robots they jump, the yellow lines they drive, the cutting in and so forth, the danger that they pose on the road. There's a massive constituency who every day wish they could do to the taxis what JP did over a week. And so that election campaign has kicked off. Because JP doesn't need to put up posters. He's got all his posters made. Those images that looks outrageous to some, that looks violent and brutal to some, breaking the taxi window, beating up the taxi driver, that's the fantasy of so many people.
Yes.
And that's the campaign that the DA has launched.
Now, also, I think that, there's blood on everyone's hands, so to speak, in the way that, as I said in the intro, commuters are the collateral damage. They are the ones that are bearing the brunt of this. When two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. Nantel, I think we've got a clip of people walking home. We can cue that up in the meantime, but I've got a comment. An all-round failure to address the political economy of the city's relationship with the taxi industry and the industry itself. Do you agree with this?
Look, I think it's a failure of governance as a whole. Certainly a failure of national governance, but an exploitation of provincial and local governance.
How so?
A studied withdrawal from the real issues, and then a performative moment in which we beat the hell out of the taxi drivers. After allowing the impunity to build up, the frustrations amongst ordinary people to build up, and for them to witness this impunity, this lawlessness, and then suddenly, knowing, and everyone who runs elections, and I've run quite a few, know that the electorate's mind is made up 6 months before the time. The 6 months to the election, it's just getting your supporters ready to vote. But the critical 2 or 3 months before that 6 months is when voters decide. And this is exactly the moment in which voters make up their mind about who they are voting for. Julius had his orgasm last week. The DA has had theirs this week. Cape Town was the stage that communicated to the DA base. And I'm now not speaking about a white base. I'm speaking about a white base. I'm speaking about a colored base. I'm speaking about the Indian base. And I'm speaking about a certain strata in the African base that is enamored with what they are seeing. Social media is telling us how the voters are deciding.
I've also seen sort of a shift in the sense of people expressing, I would say, the taxi industry losing the publicity war in a sense, losing that solidarity that commuters may have with the taxi industry for getting them to work and back. You say that there was that the DA had their climax, so to speak, and the ANC's response to this. Do you think it was on point? Do you have any assessment of what the ANC's political response to this electioneering by the DA?
I think the ANC did not understand what was happening. They were caught like deer in the headlights, and therefore they went for a knee-jerk in the Western Cape. Defend the black taxi associations. This is BEE under attack. This is the uncaring nature of the DA. And every time they spoke, they confirmed the DA message that A, the ANC stands with the lawless. B, BEE is this BEE. Because now you're making BEE a lawless sector of the industry, and therefore BEE in mining, BEE in the marine economy, BEE in this, BEE in that. It all comes down to a sense of lawlessness, not knowing what you're doing, unleashing chaos in South Africa. So you confirm the DA dog whistle that BEE is a lawless attempt to take what doesn't belong to you, to do what you want to do, to exercise impunity. And so the reasoning, the dog whistle says what the taxis do visibly is what happened at Eskom invisibly.
This is what happens when they take over.
When they take over. You don't have to say who they are. Because the ANC is saying this is an assault on black economic empowerment. The ANC says they're only doing this to our townships. And the DA knows it has given up on the township votes. It has gone for the consolidation. It is trying to get the township votes after kicking out Maimani and everyone else. They're trying to get the township votes with a moonshot. Who can get the township votes? Come into alliance with us if you are truly against the ANC.
We're going to talk about coalitions later on, but I just want to play this clip of people walking home, and it's really...
The Cape Town taxi strike really left people stranded.
That's Claremont, I think. Okay, so I just want, there was a WhatsApp going around about the subsidies received. Now the figures are sort of basically a thumb suck because it comes from somebody who generally sort of sucks his thumb for stats. But the stats are, the principle applies. It said Golden Arrow moves about 250,000 people daily and they get a provincial subsidy. MyCiti transports 35,000 people a day and they get a subsidy. The taxi industry moves 1.5 million people daily, but yet they get no subsidy. This is something that's unique to the Western Cape, whereas in other provinces there is subsidy for the public transport. I also have a comment from an insider. The only private public or mass transport operators other than minibus taxis who don't receive any subsidy are either paratransit operators in African countries which are not held to the safety licensing standards that minibus taxis are, or dollar vans in New York and minibus in Hong Kong, both of which have issues with fleet aging, reliability, price gouging, etc. All to say there are basically no examples of affordable, reliable, safe, frequent, far-reaching public transport that is not subsidized. Do you feel that the failure to address the political economy of the taxi industry lies in the approach, or rather, the approach of the Western Cape provincial government and the city towards, I would say, keeping minibus taxis from being formalized?
Look, I think from what I remember, there was always a 25 million rand subsidy for transport in the Western Cape that went almost exclusively to Golden Arrow bus services. Mm-hmm. When we were introducing the idea that we partly got from Bogota, when we got the idea of mass transit for our people, we introduced what has now become the MyCiti. But everyone will know about the Klipfontein corridor. MyCiti was meant to be a solution to the transport problems of what we call the Southeast Metro, the N2 communities, which are black and colored, and not the Northwest Metro around the N2 going all the way to Milnerton. So you will know the bicycle lanes we had in mind. You will know the way in which we were going to run the kind of mass rapid transit vehicles down Klipfontein Road from the furthest reaches of Khayelitsha through Guguletu, Manenberg, Heideveld, all the working class areas, and bring them into Cape Town and back.
On the MyCiti?
On what was then, we called it Bus Rapid.
BRT, yes.
BRT.
Yeah.
Of course, when we messed up the elections in 2009, we handed the whole caboodle over to the DA. They took the idea but rerouted it and put it precisely in the Northwest Corridor to solve the problem of Milnerton people who sit on Kuberg Road in long traffic jams in their own cars, one person sometimes in a car. So they rerouted the idea entirely that way, incorporated Atlantis, but made it too expensive for the working people of Atlantis. And so the point of the matter is that 25 million was meant to create a bus rapid spine supported by three kinds of ribs: a train, a Golden Arrow bus, and a taxi service. And the taxis bring from a community to a terminus, the bus or the station, the bus or the train, and then move further, and the BRT is the spine of a system such as that. And the 25 million was for people to bid for routes. Whoever could bring people best from Hanover Park to the BRT or to a station gets paid for managing that route, in addition to the fares they charge. If the bus moves you from Manenberg to Klipfontein Road or Mowbray, you get paid for that and you charge your fees. But the understanding is that that's a subsidy on the fees that you charge people. So the hijacking of the Klipfontein corridor and the BRT is what I would call the deliberate, built-in lawlessness that dominates the industry, the cutthroat nature of the transport industry, and the chickens come home to roost on occasions such as this. It is organized, built-in terror that is unleashed on the people. And today, we have a situation when the impunity of the taxis meet the perniciousness of the provincial and the local government, you get the tragedy that is visited on the people. And it is this that made people walk. It is this that have made people being killed. It is this that have allowed the torching of the buses, etc. The problem, though, is that every act of wanton violence confirms in the public mind why they can't be trusted with a subsidy, why they can't be trusted with our lives, why they can't be trusted with our roots. And so, in a sense, everyone walks into everyone's trap. And the ANC walks into the DA's trap by coming out completely with a knee-jerk defense and not even finding that middle road between condemning impunity and condemning the DA. The question is, did the city just come up with this? Were our councillors asleep at the wheel? Did they not ring the alarm bell ahead of time? Was it a failure of opposition that we are dealing with in the Western Cape? Or did the DA smuggle it in so deftly that no one saw it coming?
I have some input from an insider. It says, the issue at hand is that the city, industry and province met for months. They agreed on a process and the city just decided to impound. Now, in your experience as a former premier of the Western Cape, this input from the person says that, JP Smith, the MACO member for safety and security, was so out of pocket that now it requires the intervention of the provincial government. Did you ever have to deal with a MACO member who was so out of pocket that you had to then intervene in the situation as the Premier of the Western Cape?
Now look, I think in our time, what was happening at the city level was political. To a large extent, they had more resources. Disposable resources. We got conditional grants to run hospitals and schools and all of those kind of things. We had a very small grant that we could do with what we wanted to. But the city has a rate space, a tax base, that gives them the kind of largesse that they can spend as they want to. And that is why opposition, for example, in the city is absolutely crucial, because you don't need as much opposition, if I can put it like that, because the chances of you misspending your hospital money means that you may lose it next year. But in the city, when you're collecting all these rates, you're collecting water fees and increasing it, you're getting extra money on the meter electricity that you sell, you reduce the units even if the electricity is off for 5 hours a day. You're still making money. That needs enormous oppositional insight to be able to pick up what is happening. Part of an opposition is to have intelligence. Who are the officials that are decent? Who are you speaking to? Someone must come and tell you, listen, they're going to do this impounding thing. If people don't tell you, they're not trusting you.
Yeah.
Because they think you're just into political theater or you're not interested. And so, really, this notion of opposition is, and we need to see whether this is a failure of opposition or whether this is a cleverness of governance, that the DA pulled the wool over our eyes.
It's a little bit of both. We could spend hours talking about the failure of opposition, but the reason why I wanted to talk to you today is about international relations mainly. I think we have some input. Peter Cato, well done, Roscoe, thank you. Mike Clark, great show ahead. We're going to be playing a voice note, a question for you, Ebrahim, from Mike Clark. He's a professional caller in to radio stations. You will be familiar with him from SAFM. Mike from Newlands. There we go.
I'm relaxed immediately because he says it's a great show ahead.
And then Jacques Free, thanks for watching. Speaking on behalf of all South Africans with a little behind the scenes info as well. Great interview. Thank you, Jacques. Now, let's cue up that clip of Ebrahim Brigety, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. So on Friday, a report was handed to President Cyril Ramaphosa saying, with the findings of the inquiry into the Lady R, I'm going with the headline from News 24, which is behind a paywall, but don't worry, I'll read it. Lady R didn't load South African weapons to Russia, investigations find. The Russian cargo ship Lady R did not load South African weapons or ammunition when it called at the Simonstown naval base in December last year. The primary cargo that was brought to Simonstown was an old arms order that the SANDF had placed with Russia before the COVID-19 pandemic and also before the Ukraine conflict. So let's play what Ambassador Ruben Brigety said in December.
The arming of Russia by South Africa with the vessel that landed in Simonstown is fundamentally unacceptable. We are confident that weapons were loaded onto that vessel, and I would bet my life on the accuracy of that assertion. We recognize that South Africa will have multitudinous diplomatic relations around the world.
So Ruben Brigety says, he started that by saying the arming of Russia by South Africa. He's stating that as a fact, obviously, more in his opinion. And he then says he would bet his life on it. Now, you were an ambassador to the States, one of our most important strategic international partners. Why was this intervention so extraordinary? And what should have been done instead of that?
Look, the intervention is extraordinary because I know Ruben Brigety. Ruben Brigety was the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. He was the US under Obama ambassador in Addis Ababa to the African Union. I'll even go so far as to say that he's married to an Ethiopian woman. So he's not anti-African in the sense. But most importantly, he's an academic, a rector of a university. You see, what makes that interview extraordinary, because we all knew there were no arming of Russia. It's a preposterous idea that South Africa could arm Russia for their war in Ukraine. It was outrageous because Ruben Brigety actually put his credibility on the line to issue a warning to South Africa.
And he bet his life on it.
He bet his life on it. He's not going to pay a price because no one in the US has denounced him. In fact, they may say to him, job well done. South Africa became careful. They went to negotiate with Putin to pull out. They sent a team over to the US to negotiate a goer because someone needed, in their mind, to tell South Africa, as he said, it's unacceptable. But it would simply be diplomatic chat. If I were to say, listen, South Africa, you can't be siding with Putin.
And this is behind the scenes, not in a media conference.
And this is behind the scenes. So there's a protocol breach.
Let's go through what the protocol should have been.
The protocol should have been that he raises his issues and provides his proof to South Africa. Not South Africa establish a committee of inquiry, a judicial inquiry. The onus is on the alleger to bring the proof, not on the allegee to provide the proof.
You can't prove a negative.
You can't prove a negative. But that tells me that Ruben Brigety is far too intelligent to have made a blustering mistake. He issued a warning. They in Washington would say, job well done. Because from that moment, South Africa's swagger was impeded. From that moment, South Africa understood the balancing between its values for a multilateral world and its interest. All the jobs that come with AGOA and the free trade and all of those kind of things. South Africa sent out 2 diplomatic missions, one to Putin to say, listen man, can you hold off, don't come. The other one to the USA to say, listen, we need AGOA. In fact, we need it beyond 2025 and we need it, you to announce it earlier. So for them, job done. The fall guy is Ruben Brigety, but he wouldn't take that fall because A, he's too intelligent, B, he has a guarantee. You're not going to face any price. We're not even going to say, oh, this was an unfortunate thing. You make the allegation and then you apologize for doing it, but the message is heard. If they had, in their calculation, it was too urgent to be able to take the diplomatic route, to do what was done. And so in a sense, the outcome of it is one that makes more urgent the need for a multilateral world. Our response to the US says, we're not exactly at this multilateral world, at this multipolarity that we want. Because China may be growing, but its growth is absorbed by a very poor population. The US may be slowing, but it has a hell of a lot of disposable income that it can use for armies, which China can't necessarily do, to hegemonize itself over the world. That's the fundamental difference between two growth rates. South Africa can grow tomorrow, but immediately the proceeds of its growth will have to go to the poor, yes, in form of services. Another country, like Qatar, can grow, and they can order hundreds of fighter jets because its population is looked after already. And so we can't do GDP comparisons as easily as that in order to determine multipolarity. Multipolarity has to be built, it has to be thought through, it has to be agitated for, it has to be lobbied for, it has to be argued for. Intellectually, a proposition must be put that can collect enough people, and then at the same time you must hope that the arrogance of the superpower overreaches. The fact today that there are countries like Saudi Arabia, there are countries like Indonesia, there are countries like Malaysia and Singapore who want to join BRICS, is beginning to say that US under Trump and the insularity that Biden has continued and the disinterest in the world has created enough of a looseness, but that looseness hasn't been collected and repositioned and reorganized into a truly multilateral situation. And what the US has done with South Africa, it's not an example only for South Africa. It's an example for all those who dream of multipolarity. It says, we still have the power to bully you.
Now, we obviously, that was a warning shot that took a hell of a toll on our economy. Like the rand tanked in that Friday. And this is not unique to South Africa. I know that in Egypt, there were interventions by the US to try to get them to close their airspace to Russian aircraft. Do you think that the United States, or rather the Atlantic powers, let's call them like NATO powers and the United States, are trying to trammel us and other countries that seek to walk their own path into a conflict that they have invested so much of their geostrategic futures in? I'm talking specifically about Ukraine.
You see, the US knows that there is a growing values base amongst the former non-aligned movement people, that they're all beginning to speak a language about a more balanced world, about a more egalitarian world. They're all beginning to speak a language about that we have seen the dangers of unilateralism with Iraq and so forth. They're beginning to stand up against hypocrisy in foreign relations. That you can't say to Saudi Arabia, yeah, invade there, and then you want to say, hey, Russia, you're not allowed to invade there. So all of these are coalescing a few values, cardinal values. What the US is calling in, it knows it can't appeal to those values. The US is calling in its interests, its markers. South Africa, you can speak nicely in the world, but 200,000 jobs depend on AGOA. Your AIDS program can collapse if we pull back PEPFAR. Your car factory will close if we don't import your BMWs.
Is it an agenda to kind of by the United States to have us almost walk two paths on a diverging road, in the sense that we have to protect AGOA, to protect our jobs? They're making us choose between AGOA and assistance from the West and being part of BRICS in a sense. How do we repair relationships with the United States and still continue to be part of a realignment in a way?
You see, in the United States, when I was ambassador, and this kind of conundrum or dilemma was debated with me about South Africa having its cake and eating it, AGOA and PEPFAR and trade with the US and investment from the US and then BRICS. I would always point to them and say, listen, BRICS is an outer circle and IPSA is an inner circle. If you look at BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and you look at IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the outer circle, BRICS, is a circle of emerging markets. The inner circle, Brazil, India, South Africa, would then have constituted a circle of emerging democratic powers. So we knew the difference between who we had political commonness with and who we had economic interests with. The collapse of IPSA has left us only with BRICS. So we're sitting ourselves with a conundrum, because there are certain democratic values that we hold dear, but that's not shared by all of our BRICS partners. And so we must declare BRICS an emerging market forum and do our value discussions, our values discussion elsewhere.
Because I was going to ask, how do we manage tensions within BRICS? Let's come into BRICS now, because...
But let me just conclude this point.
Okay.
You see, the intellectual art that South Africa was capable of, historically, since 94, was the ability to hold two opposing thoughts in one head, to balance out our values with our interests, to be able to manage contradiction in a way that didn't cheese off those that we are indebted to in interests and those that we share values with. Mandela, because of his moral authority, was able to tell Clinton and them where to get off when they tried to dictate to him about Gaddafi and Castro. He could do that without compromising. The next day he could go and say, listen, we want to extend BRICS, we want to extend AGOA. We need more PEPFAR money. Because that was, Thabo didn't have Madiba's moral authority, but he was intellectually, he understood on the other hand that he did, because he wasn't that person, he needed Africa behind him. And so he presented South Africa's interests and values based in the AU and in NEPAD, and spoke with the power of a continent. We've lost that ability to harness the idea of holding two thoughts in one head, balancing interests and values, and being able to advance on both fronts seamlessly almost.
So coming back to our values and our interests and holding those two thoughts in our head in a way, that would almost enable us to be neutral in the war in Ukraine, but still within BRICS, because BRICS is a different structure as opposed to NATO, which is a security structure. BRICS is like an economic structure, but yet that is being held against us in a way. Our audacity to balance our interests and our values, we're sort of being trampled into this conflict. How do we resist that?
No, by arguing intellectually and politically. We should be saying, listen, America, how did you react in 1962 when the Soviet Union wanted to poke missiles up your backside from Cuba?
They lost their minds.
You lost it completely. You held the world ransom. You threatened nuclear force. Now you can do the same thing in Ukraine by sticking your bases and your missiles up Russia's bum. There's no need for an expansion of NATO. NATO is an anachronism. You've won the Cold War. What is this megalomania to expand NATO from countries that have never smelt the North Atlantic Ocean? Now we should be arguing that. We should be arguing that if it appears that we are standing closer to Russia, it's because if you defeat Russia, there is a power vacuum in the world. And a power vacuum in the world, you've seen just the transition from the Soviet Union to the post-Cold War Eurasia. It created chaos. Millions died, Chechens died, everyone, as all those Stans fought for their freedom. Who gives you the right to want to create a vacuum in the world? Have you considered the consequences? Now again, you see, we don't have to be obstreperous and stubborn when we should be intellectual and political. You see, that's the art that I think South Africa has not necessarily stood for in the current situation.
Now it's been about 550 days since the Ukraine-Russia crisis broke out. And there's still no end in sight, at least what I can see. Thousands are dying to win a few hundred yards on the battlefield. Now, a lot of countries have eschewed neutrality, and they've sort of painted the scarlet letter on countries like South Africa who have declared their neutrality in this conflict. How is neutrality an asset, and how does diplomacy, the neutrality in diplomacy work to deconflict and to take steps to end this crisis, which won't if it ends militarily, it will end in absolute world-ending catastrophe?
Look, the first thing is to get an elegance of language. Neutrality versus non-alignment. Mm-hmm. Because there may be some values about the multipolarity and the expansion of NATO that are threatened by going into Ukraine, by the USA and recruiting it to NATO. And so values should weigh a little bit heavier. And so between your core values of not wanting a vacuum in the world, not wanting an expansion of NATO, not wanting to have a unipolar world, etc., will always outweigh on another scale the interests that come with jobs and trade and AGOA and all of those. So maybe neutrality is not, but non-aligned in a conflict is. What are the benefits of a possible non-alignment by South Africa? You see, the United States is trying to create only a front door for Russia. If you want peace, you're going to have to come through us in the front door, and we are the West, we are America, we are Europe, we are the UK. What non-alignment allows Putin is a backdoor. We all now know that Putin is an equally stubborn guy, equally driven by pride, that goes back to a whole Russian history. And maybe a nostalgia for a Soviet Union. But that's a guy that may require a backdoor if the conflict must end. But the US is saying, let's build a house without a backdoor.
Only one way to peace, and that's the defeat.
And that's the absolute defeat. I think what South Africa, and by extension Africa, has stumbled upon is the idea of saying to Putin, listen, my brother, if you want to get out of this, we have the back door. Take a piece that Africa offers. Don't take the piece that they're offering. You see, I think 550 days into that war requires a back door. And I think that South Africa needs to explore a lot more aggressively that, and it must pronounce to the West that we are the only hope of ending the zero-sum game. We know that you want to play that game, but allow us. You admired us for our peacemaking in South Africa. Allow us the space for peacemaking in the world, and particularly now, Russia-Ukraine.
Now, the conflict in Ukraine is seen by many as a proxy war between effectively China and the Atlantic states. I've heard it said that take out Russia to take out China, and we've seen in many cases the people declaring in the US polity that China is America's number one geostrategic opponent. Do you prescribe to this view?
I'm not too sure. China, despite the radicalness of their system, is a very risk-averse, conservative power. It is not going to be sucked into something it doesn't want to get into. So it knows that it mustn't enter the terrain of battle that the US invites them to, because that is the US terrain of strength, military, diplomatic, making the world choose sides, etc., etc. The US has too many interest-based relations with too many countries. China knows it must just continue to build the economic capacity of China. It must just be able to continue holding 40% of US bonds. It must just continue to export its good and displace US manufacturing goods in the US itself. It must just continue to do the trade relations with Africa and ensure that if raw materials are sold to China, they sell it back as manufactured steel and manufactured this and manufactured that to the West. It will be the factory. So it's not going to go and fall for any adventure. So I think that there's a lot of conspiracy around, and I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding of China's appetite for adventure. China knows it is the true purveyor of the long war and not the great gesture. It knows when to pull back, and it's creating spheres of influence. Who would have thought that the Middle East would increasingly become a Chinese sphere of influence?
I have, in March, of course, China brokered a deal between Saudi and Iran, and this sent shockwaves through the US political, diplomatic machinery, because the US has been trying to broker this peace for a really long time, and it signaled that the emergence of China as a leader in diplomacy in the Middle East. Should America be afraid of being replaced as the, I would say, interlocutor between people who are in conflict?
I think America has to recover from the perception that it is hypocritical in brokering peace. It has too many double standards at play. Because, and let me put it this way. I always maintain that foreign policy, like many other policies, is like a telescope. It has two lenses. One is the lens of your values, and the other is the lens of your interest. The classical moment of someone holding the lens of their value against their eyes and view their interest through the perspective of their values was when Nelson Mandela stood up to Sani Abacha and condemned him for wanting to execute Ken Saro-Wiwa. Everyone in the ANC said, hey, Nigeria is too big, you don't do this. But Mandela kept his values lens against his eye and said, I'll manage my interest, but my values come first. What the US has done is to turn that telescope around. It views the whole world through the lens of its interests and therefore compromises its values. And therefore in the Middle East it cannot be an honest broker because it goes to a negotiating table and says, Israel is our friend, we will stand by you forever, arm you forever. Okay, Arabs, let's talk. It does the same thing. Iran is our enemy, we will never do this with Iran, etc., etc. Tear up the nuclear agreement. Okay, Saudi Arabia, let's talk. So the fact of the matter is that there are too many of those kind of inconsistencies for the US to be in. It can mediate between two countries where it owns both.
I like, for example.
But it cannot do that easily where it owns one country and not the other. Because everyone knows how that will work.
Let's queue up that thing from Mike from Newlands. But in the meantime, we got comment from Leonard Ramatlakani, your comrade. Good interview. Janice Olivia Rademacher says these riots do feel like the 80s riots. And Carlos Felipe Mesquita, a friend of the show, I have a gut feel that they are puppet master at work with what's happening in the current unrest. Things seem too orchestrated and planned. Do you have any input into the comments, Ebrahim?
No, look, I think that it's been a long time since you've been afraid to put your children on the road, send them to university, send your daughter to work. So I do think that it has something like that, except that this time around it's not color-coded, that if you are darker skinned, you're likely to get through the barricade. I think that means that, unlike the 80s, it's not political. It is criminal violence. It is commercially driven criminal violence. And there are no free passes for anyone. In fact, in this case, black people are bearing the brunt of that violence. It's not white people who are in the firing line. And so in a sense, there is an anxiety and a fear, but you almost fear that there's no respect for anything. This impunity means that anyone can be a victim if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I do feel there's that. I think puppet masters, as Carlos says, I think it is built into the system. It's like landmines. It's planted well ahead of time, waiting for someone to step on it. What was the detonator? Impoundments. But the landmines have been laid a long time in the transport industry. Now you're getting different people. The detonator, impoundments. The taxi industry steps on the next landmine, explodes it. Someone else comes in, explodes the next one. And then the e-hailing drives over a landmine. Then Golden Arrow drives over a landmine. It comes. So it's in a sense, when I say it's inbuilt, it's like in Mozambique. After Renamo left, they left all those landmines. And even Lady Di or Princess Diana came to champion the lifting of those landmines and removing them as a danger. We don't have a Lady Diana to lift these landmines. And that's the point about opposition. It could be outraged, but it could set itself up as the kind of safe detonation of those landmines. If I were anywhere in leadership, I would want to understand, how do we gather the real detonators, or in this case, diffusers of those landmines? What's the vision for a transport industry free of those landmines? And to put that forward aggressively and compellingly to the people of the Western Cape.
Speaking of landmines, let's hear what Mike from Newlands has to say.
Ebrahim, and forgive me once again, I really would like to be a bit more formal, but
No
nevertheless, you once said, it was quite a while back, so things have probably changed, and I'm sure you have as well, but you said that what pissed off the Americans was that a black man won the vote, or won as became president of America. Yet the majority of the Americans were predominantly white. It's made absolutely no sense to me. In America, it is not a racist country, unlike South Africa. Here, skin color is everything, and to you, it seems to be a big issue as well. But in America, they do what they do best, and that is vote in the best man for the job. That is why America is so successful and has so many successful industries. And that is why we are in the disaster we are in, because we choose people on their skin color, not on their ability. They are judged and chosen on skin color, not on the ability to do the job. Thanks, Roscoe, and great show.
Thanks, Mike. Ebrahim, I see you taking copious notes there in response to Mike. So
No, look, the 2009 elections was essentially a good one for an Obama to win. He had a great campaign, but he got a hospital pass. It was better for him to bail out the banks, to bail out JP Morgan, bail out the housing institutions, and to sell that to an angry constituency who wondered, why the hell are you bailing them out when they've caused this disaster? And so it was a good one, but for the first time, they call former presidents Mr. President. Mm-hmm. The current president wasn't even called Mr. President. And so they immediately went on the dog whistle with Hussein.
Barack Hussein Obama.
Yes. And all of those kind of things. So I think he understood what it was, and he spent the first 2 years appeasing, hoping that it would work. But the fact of the matter is that it was on his watch that Trayvon Martin got killed, that Floyd got killed, that all of those, and I'm sorry, Mike, they're all black.
Mike says that United States is a perfect meritocracy and it's not racist at all.
Yes, and the point of the matter is that just like the colored community in the Western Cape disproportionately fills up the prisons, the African American community in the USA disproportionately fill up the prisons. And that's a reflection of the socio-economic and the socio-pathological underpinnings that comes from communities who have been enslaved, the victims of segregation, the victims of apartheid, etc., etc. So the point of the matter is that, and the perfect democracy and elections, Americans would kill for our turnout. 27% of Americans vote. And then they split 50-50. And then they never give anyone a clear mandate. So America is this car that drives with one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brakes. It's like a popper wheelie. Lots of noise, lots of movement, but all in one place. That's why they haven't passed a budget for the last few years. That's your perfect democracy. They can't even pass a budget. They just print more money. And so you don't want to be 80 years old in America. 80-year-olds still work. You've got to hold on 2 jobs. There's no sick leave.
Labor protections are being eaten away by
all of those things.
Amazon.
So the point of the matter is, it's a wonderfully generous society. I've discovered that. But it has deep fault lines. We are hard on ourselves 30 years into democracy. America is where it is because 270 years ago, or thereabouts, it had independence. For the next 100 years, they coexisted with slavery. For the next 150 years, they coexisted with not allowing women to vote. The next, up till the 60s, they coexisted with segregation. I mean, how do you coexist with deep fundamental pathologies for 200 years after you declare yourself the greatest democracy? So this is not the point at which to debate all of that. The issue is we are coexisting 30 years with a lot of inherited pathologies. But you know, the difference is we call it out. We know when someone is manipulating the taxes, and we know when the taxes are acting with impunity. We know that these are the corrupt people, and we don't always get it right to put them in jail when they should be put in jail, because they have changed the system. It's no coincidence that the first thing that happened after 2009 in South Africa was the dissolving of the Scorpions. It was the corrupt anticipating that they don't want to be put in jail. Then they could go to the state-owned enterprises. Fortunately, the Constitution and our institutions kicked in when they tried to take over Treasury. And the fight back happened. But that's how deep they implanted themselves. So I agree that that there's no easy reach for color if there is a better explanation. But there is no whitewashing or blackwashing the color away. Not in America and not in South Africa.
Now, Donald Trump, can you imagine your tenure as ambassador to America under a Trump presidency? What would the difference have been? Whereas you had been an ambassador under the Obama administration. What were the fundamental differences between serving as ambassador to America under Obama as opposed to what would have been serving under Trump?
Look, I had a bit of an advantage that in 2006, an unknown senator from Illinois visited South Africa and no one knew him. The president of South Africa didn't see him, the vice president didn't see him. At the end of the day, the only real three people other than NGOs that he went to see was Archbishop Tutu, Trevor Manuel, and myself. And we had a wonderful 2-hour, because he had lots of time, 2-hour discussion, and I gave him a picture of Nelson Mandela's speech the day he was released. And so, to a large extent, that eased things a lot. It also helped that he understood me as appointed by President Zuma, but that I was not, in the classical sense, loyal to that, because it was that he understood why I was asked to resign as Premier of the Western Cape. So I had quite a few advantages that allowed me to have sometimes in protocol debates in the United States, but always from a good place. In 2012, I met Donald Trump the first time at Mar-a-Lago, and you could see here was a guy of a completely different, but he was nominally a Democrat.
Yes, I remember a New York guy.
Yes, and that was just before he came to speak at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And he had said, "Oh, Ambassador, you make a fine speech. Can you write my speech? So I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to even suggest what is in. So I said, Mr. Trump, they say no one can make a speech, prepare a speech for you. He says, oh, that's also right. So that's how I got out of it. So I've had a little bit of an exposure to that. And, I think my sense of Trump was that the United States was asleep and Trump was the alarm clock. But they didn't treat that election as a referendum about what are their values. They treated it as another contest for power. Whereas I thought that Trump offered America the ability to fundamentally have a referendum about who they are, what they stand for, what their values are, how do they become better, a more perfect union, to use Americanism. And I think they missed the boat. They just went back into a power contest. And that's unfortunately the thing, because and that's part of the perfect election that Mike speaks about. It's that lobbies are very powerful. When we were in the USA, do you know how many prominent people came to us to offer us their lobbying services for AGOA? And we kept on saying, no, we don't do lobbying. We will present our own case to the people that need to hear the case. So the point of the matter is that there has been a very good outcome also in the US. It's been at the expense of elections, but you've had Black Lives Matter emerge. You've had unprecedented cross-sectional unity between, for example, Muslims who suffer Islamophobia and blacks who suffer racism. You've even had tentative rapprochement between Muslims, black people, and even the LGBT, because they understood that the condition that they're all suffering under Trump and in the USA generally were all siblings of bigotry. And so, if anything came out of the Trump years, it's been an awakening and a self-reliance by organizations. And in this case, the Muslim community, the black community, the LGBT community, etc., understanding that they have to fight and they've got to organize. And most of the times I've been called back to the USA was because, and I say this with the 40th anniversary of the ANC in the month of the UDF in the month of August, it is to explain to people how to form a UDF, how to transgress your own boundaries, and then how to work with others. And so the point that I would make is that when you have values and principled commonalities, you form alliances. When you share strategic objectives, you form coalitions. And when you just have common campaigns and projects, you form fronts. Now that's the lesson of South Africa. That's the footprint we leave in a country like the USA, because the USA will bully everybody unless there's a different voice and narrative in the USA, and South Africa can be influential in that sphere.
So, first of all, I now know how to pronounce the word rapprochement. Say it again?
Rapprochement.
Rapprochement.
I think so.
Coming closer, rapprochement. Another word that comes from the French that I want to talk about is coup d'etat. And there have been so many of those in West Africa. Now something, I don't know whether it's something in the water maybe in West Africa, or maybe it's the fact that in West Africa it's the footprint of French colonialism. But the chickens have come home to roost now. What do you think is driving these coup d'etats in West Africa?
I think every colonial power leaves unique landmines.
Landmines.
And we've spoken about the Portuguese leaving counter-revolutionary movements. UNITA in Angola and Renamo. And South Africa has played a big role for example, under apartheid, to manage those landmines for the Portuguese colonial power. I think the British colonialism, their landmines, is in how they've institutionalized inequality, how they've distributed land in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, how they've distributed wealth and ownership of that wealth on behalf of the settlers, in a sense that they've left behind. In North Africa, it's much more the landmines of neocolonialism, the strategic role that the United States played over the oil-producing MENA region, that gave all of those countries a triple bypass of democracy, human rights, and freedom. To say, we love democracy and human rights and freedom, the United States stands for it, but let's give a blind eye to the MENA region. I think the special gift of landmines that the French left, and the French have always been cruder in their colonialism. They did not often pretend to civilize their colonizers, put that word in inverted commas. It was a crude one, it was militarily enforced, and the decolonization always gave the colonial power access to all the wealth. First, right of refusal for all the minerals. Control over their reserve banks. In fact, sometimes holding the reserves for those countries. A complete dependency in terms of military, health, education. A complete skewing of the infrastructure that the planes must go to Paris and then go back to Africa from there. And so these landmines that are left behind get detonated from time to time. Someone steps on them. And I think the most recent one that saw the landmine and decided to try and defuse it was Senegal, to refuse to abide by those conditions. And in I think 79, you had many others rebelling about the conditionality of the decolonization. And so I think that coups are often a rearrangement of power when someone sees a landmine and threatens to defuse it or to address it. It then becomes more possible to want to replace that one who will manage the landmines and not try and defuse them. So I'm not sure it's anything in the water. I think it's something in the colonial agreements.
Because I'm reading from People's Dispatch. Endowed with Africa's highest grade of uranium ores, Niger is the world's 7th largest producer of this nuclear fuel, while Niger itself remains one of the lowest consumers of electricity, with an electrification rate of only about 17.5%. Its uranium has been powering a third of light bulbs in France. Now, obviously nobody wants to support a coup or a military takeover of any country. I think it's a measure of last resort of absolute desperation. But people need to understand that the hold over the resources in West Africa, this stuff goes to French companies. It goes to France as the former colonial power. I also, the rationale for for keeping soldiers in Niger. I get this data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Niger has experienced continuous growth in jihadist activity since 2018, with the record for violence in 2021 measured by fatalities. Now, do you think that, first of all, former colonial powers have a vast military footprint in Africa? Do you think, and also they extract resources from Africa for the benefit of the former colonial powers? How can we change that political economy so that we can develop our own resources in Africa and have benefication of our minerals here?
Look, that's the core of NEPAD, the new plan for Africa's development.
We don't hear much of NEPAD anymore. It's
there are so many things that we attribute to the last 9 years. One of the worst things that we can attribute is our loss of interest in Africa. The loss of being able to see us integrated into an Africa, and that prosperity has to be mutual. I think that there are some really good benefits that are persisting, like the African Union, like the Continental Free Trade Agreement, making all of that work. But the point is, when I went to the US in 2010, we had 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa. I think we've had a setback. We've had greater bargaining power, because when South Africa was very interested in Africa, especially under Thabo Mbeki, we didn't negotiate one country at a time with China. We formed the China-Africa. Then we formed the France-Africa dialogue. Then we formed the UK-Africa. Then we inspired President Obama in 2014 to have the US-Africa Leaders Summit, so that Africa spoke with one voice. But we knew also that we needed to manage conflict, manage our development trajectory, and so forth. So the issue of NEPAD was absolutely critical for beneficiation and to bargain for the means for beneficiation in Africa. And I think that what was our strength became our weakness, in the sense that Africa was in awe of South Africa. Firstly, they all knew all about us because they supported us. Secondly, they trusted our intellect and our ability to go and present us to the world. And that's why South Africa in BRICS is a proxy for Africa, rather than just a country on its own. And so in a sense, I think we have lost momentum in Africa. The institutions may still be there, but I'm not sure how dynamic they are in terms of delivering those things. And that's why a country like France can take its chances again, because it's no longer dealing with a united continent, francophone, lusophone, and anglophone. It can now pick off the francophones and say, remember this agreement. And I think that we need South Africa to get its bearings again, because South Africa, to a large extent, has the organizing ability to cohere Africa, to give momentum to its plans, and to drive it and present it to the world.
Now, ECOWAS, as I mentioned in the introduction, has threatened to possibly even maybe militarily intervene in Niger. Now, ECOWAS is split, and allies of Niger have said that if you attack Niger, that's a declaration of war on us as well, countries like Burkina Faso. My fear is that West Africa becomes another proxy war fought between the great powers of the world. How can we de-escalate this? What could be a looming conflict?
Look, the old adage that we had, African solutions for African problems, worked best when it was the whole of Africa. What has happened in the last decade or so is that we've regionalized Africa. So now we are allowing regional hegemons to dictate the terms rather than the values that emanate from the African center, representing the African perspective as a whole. And so when you drill down to regional interventions, and it makes sense from a logistical point of view, but not from a political or a geopolitical point of view, because someone has to extricate Francophone out of itself and paint the bigger picture for them, show them the fingerprints of the French on it, and warn against the tendencies for hegemonic rivalry within the region, like as is happening at this point. There's no easy and quick way out of it. But the point of it is that maybe it's our distance out here on the south of the continent that gives us a perspective to the north, that allows us to make sense of what everyone knows, but they don't connect the dots as neatly because they are mired in the here and now and not necessarily the big picture. And so that's the role that South Africa played over the last 30 years until we had our moment of distraction and we got inward looking rather than playing this role, not a big brother role, but a big picture role on the African continent.
Do you think the African Union is still relevant, or do you think that people living in West Africa would find more relevance in the clout of ECOWAS, or in East Africa being more swayed by the East African community, or Southern African Development Community holding more sway in our region than the AU would have as an institutional authority?
I think that's a function of regionalization in Africa, that we are retreating into our SADCs, into our ECOWAS, into our East African community, into our MENA, etc., etc. I think we're allowing that, and so maybe the center is not holding as tightly or not imposing itself as greatly as it used to do in those halcyon years when we were all dreaming about the Renaissance and the NEPAD and the peer review and all of those kind of things. So we shouldn't be nostalgic. Maybe it has gone. But the fact of the matter is that I get worried when some countries, for example, allow a footprint of the American military that was always based in Stuttgart, AFRICOM. Its headquarters were always in Germany. But it is finding its way in, sometimes to help the Lord's Resistance Army, sometimes to come in there, sometimes to establish a little base in Djibouti, etc. So I think
that's a big base in Djibouti.
Yeah, but the African Union was against it. But it's happening by stealth.
They can operate with impunity, effectively.
So the point of the matter is that when you go to regionalism, it's a small step away from going to nationalism. And each country deciding what is best for it. That its interest is paramount rather than anything else.
So a few comments before we go on to one of the last topics. A reply by Peter Cato, definitely the people in blue. I have a gut feeling that there are puppet masters at work. Reply from Peter Cato, definitely the people in blue. Andre Fortain says, yes, Zuma and ANC was setback, referring to the 9 wasted years, 9 lost years. What is the Holland?
Depends on how strongly you feel it was.
Yeah. Right, so let's talk Israel-Palestine. This is the enduring conflict. I'm going to start by asking you straight up, is Israel an apartheid state?
Look, I always say, is a door a door? If it is a big piece of wood that can close something, it's looking like a door. If it has hinges that can turn, it's looking like a door. If it has a handle that can open and close, it's looking like a door. If it has a key lock that can shut the door, it's a door. So the point is that my initial thoughts on all of that many years ago, when the idea of using the comparison with apartheid, I thought it may lead to intellectual laziness. It was good for popular mobilization because apartheid was a globally known phenomenon. And so maybe borrowing that is good to mobilize a solidarity movement, but it shouldn't be easy enough for the strategists of a resistance to simply pick up the idea of apartheid. I think from the moment it was used, it appeared as if the Israelis were hell-bent to prove that they can be better at apartheid and more brutal. The wall was something unprecedented even in apartheid. Collective punishment. Even the Afrikaner regime, the white regime, had a pretense towards the rule of law. They put Al-Qaeda to death in the courts. Not collective punishment.
So there's an extrajudicial element that is exercised with impunity.
You see, when Gandhi came to South Africa over 100 years ago, he came as this brilliant lawyer to defend an Indian Muslim whose land was being taken away. He soon discovered, as he says, that you can be the most brilliant lawyer, but if the law is fundamentally wrong, you've got to use other means. And that's where the lawyer became the Mahatma. He started to lead the defiance campaigns. So the point that I'm making is that all of these things to supporters of Israel would all appear legal because it's on the law books. But the law is bereft of morality, of ethics, of correctness, of rightness. And so I think that, to come to short, I think they've perfected where apartheid left off. They've brutalized even more what apartheid may have been hesitant to do. And there is an impunity with which they operate because someone has their back, right or wrong.
Now, when somebody criticizes the state of Israel and the political system of apartheid that's in operation there, the easy go-to by defenders of the status quo in Israel is to say, well, you're anti-Semitic. There has to be a separation between the state of Israel, the right-wing state of Israel, and Judaism are completely divergent things. In fact, almost at opposite ends of conception in a way.
You know, we understood in South Africa the difference between a white person and an apartheid system. And we never gave up on bringing white people into the struggle because A, it taught us non-racialism, that not all white people are bad. And B, it created dissent in the white edifice to show that your own people don't agree with you. Find what you're doing in their name inhuman. I think we have a similar objective between Zionism and Judaism. Mm-hmm. We almost have to take responsibility to salvage Judaism because the Zionist project wants to found its ideology in Judaism and therefore does not allow Jews to hold a dissenting view that Judaism equals Zionism. But it is for us who must salvage the Jewish soul to say, I will never disparage you as a Jew, even if you make the fusion between Judaism and Zionism. I will always oppose political Zionism because it's politics and it's an ideology. Sometimes, in our anger, some of us make a mistake by disparaging Jews. Sometimes, in our intellectual cleverness, we say all Jews are Zionists. But you leave yourself no room to deal with the person who is Jewish, and once you commit to the idea of the fusion, you have done the job of Zionism. Once you admit to the fusion of those two identities, you have no one to appeal to. And we have begun to see that on the campuses in the United States, there's the growth of the Solidarity movement, the BDS movement, the anti-Zionist movement, and populated also by Jews. We have begun to see certain movements in Israel itself that doesn't give us necessarily hope of redemption, but it's enough to split the edifice, that there are standards that some people will not want to cross. And for as long as there are those, we've got to continue to appeal to the Jewishness in people, even if we know that they are the biggest Zionists, because that's the grip on their conscience that we have. And I say this because history has a tendency of freezing over. Once there was a sprawling Ottoman Empire. Today there's a country called Turkey. Once there was a whole Middle East that was the Hijaz. Today you have Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria, and Yemen. Once there was a Germany that was from Prussia to France. Today you have Germany. So history has a way. And when the Zionist architects today say we are creating facts on the ground, they know the freezing effect of history. And so that makes us rethink completely what kind of political solution, what kind of state should there be where there is today Palestine, Israel, and that section of the Middle East.
Do you think that a two-state solution is still a viable proposition?
I think the facts on the ground have killed it.
So what then takes the place of this two-state solution?
You see, I once compared scenarios for Palestine, Israel, based on cheeses. Where we are going to now is what is called the Swiss cheese. It's an Israel from the sea to the river, from the top to the bottom, with holes.
Those holes being
where the Palestinians, but the rest of it is de facto Israel. Mm-hmm. That's what is being constructed in front of our eyes.
Enclosure of Palestinians.
What we supported 30 years ago was the Colby Jack cheese. It's got streak of yellow, a streak of cream. The two states side by side. That's been destroyed. The walls have destroyed it. The settlements have destroyed it. Gaza, the non-contiguousness of the Palestinian side have destroyed the idea of a two-state solution. And the behavior, I may add, of elements in the PA, the Palestinian Authority, that have not seen a future and therefore only looked at what they can gain in the present. I think we are at the point where you've got to consider the cheddar cheese. One democratic state.
Israel, no Palestine, just a new state that...
A new, inclusive, democratic state. You see, the point of the matter is that, when we have the Palestinian solidarity marches and rallies in South Africa and all over the world, but particularly in South Africa, we have this slogan in Arabic that says, with our soul and with our blood, we will advance the cause of Quds and Palestine. I'm saying, with our souls, yes. With our blood, not necessarily. The Palestinians are brave enough. But let's add a third dimension. To be ruh bidam. Let's add bi'aql with our strategic wisdom. That's the role that South Africa ought to be playing. And so, for me, the idea is that we need to be able to say to the Palestinians, change tack. And we've particularly got to say it to the PA, to PLO Fatah. Let's agree that there's a point at which we must walk away from the two-state and say we want a single, unitary, democratic state. One person, one vote. It eliminates the borders, it eliminates this, it eliminates that. Let's do it. I suspect that the conflict is given oxygen because of the possibility of a two-state, which the Zionists are eroding with facts on the ground. And maybe what we need to do is to change the calculus and to say, you've made it impossible. The two-state, it's gone. Let's go for a cheddar cheese state.
Cheddar cheese. Well, coming back to the homegrown cheddar cheese and a PA of a different type, the one that the Patriotic Alliance who went to Israel to study coalitions there, and they are now using that information to I don't want to play on the word.
I don't want to play on the word, but the Patriotic Alliance ought to know the Israelis take no prisoners. I don't know how they entertain them, but the fact of the matter is that, look, Musi Maimane did it. This is, and I think in part of our thinking through it, I've had to think very hard, why is it that your right-wing Christians in America who have been historically anti-Semitic, because for a number of reasons, suddenly there was a change of ideology. Suddenly you got Jews for Jesus and Christians for Israel. And you begin to wonder, in South Africa, there are middle-class blacks who are very much buying into that ideology. And it is consistent with the growth of an evangelical strain in Christian theology that believes that the second coming of Jesus is only possible with a pacification of Israel.
Millenarian, effectively.
It's the millenarium idea. And so, if we don't understand that, we, in a sense, play into the hands when we over-Muslimize our solidarity. Because we are now not playing chess with them. We are playing dominoes. They put down a 6, we put down a 6. They put down a 2, we put down a 2. That's playing dominoes. Anyone can play dominoes. But this is the strategic wisdom that needs chess. And so we've got to change the calculus. We've got to appeal to the actors in Palestine. Because, you see, unfortunately, the Palestinians haven't learned a very important lesson from the South African solidarity movement. We had probably the greatest solidarity movement that the world has ever seen. But that's because we didn't confuse the world with our politics. We had a simple slogan, 5 issues. A united, non-racial, democratic and free and non-sexist South Africa. That was our vision. We didn't say, support us because we stand for non-racialism and they stand for Africanism and this about black consciousness and this. We didn't do that. And when we take over, we will push the whites into the sea, and when they take over, we will do this. You see, sometimes I get the impression that we are not recruited into a solidarity movement. We are recruited into factions. So we argue louder about Hamas versus Fatah. We are more passionate about it. Whereas what we should be doing is to use our strategic wisdom, our moral clout to say, listen man, here is a platform that you must agree on. Why don't we try this cheddar cheese platform? Can we unite around this? And for the first time, let it reverberate throughout the world that the Palestinians who have been in enmity with each other even are agreeing on this platform and send shivers throughout the world. But we are recruited into factions rather than into, and I will condemn you if you are Fatah and I am Hamas. I will call you a sellout.
Well, let's land the plane back home in South Africa. Just quickly, I know you've spent, I said 90 minutes and you've gone over that, but coalitions in South Africa. Now, you cobbled together a coalition for the ANC in the Western Cape. The ANC achieved 46%, and you were then able to govern the province of the Western Cape. Now, the national picture is looking similar to, at least in terms of the consensus of projections as to where the ANC will land, more or less. Some say sort of between 45 to 50. My personal view is I think the ANC are going to get over 50%, like just about. But a lot of the discourse is around coalitions and preempting a lot of those things. So what are your thoughts about next year's elections and where we could land in terms of the different scenarios of coalitions?
Look, the first thing you've got to look at is what exists. You've got a firm in the middle, ANC, that has had 67%, 62% under Mandela, 67% under Thabo, then back to 60% under Zuma, and then CR, or the President Ramaphosa, kept it at 57%. That movement is largely by turnout, not always by defection. You don't find defection, you find turnout. On the right, you've had a solid, at best 28%, maybe 25%, but it was shared between the National Party, the Democratic Party, the Freedom Front, etc., until the DA gobbled them all up and now controls that 25% on the right. On the left, there's been a displacement effect. It's been almost around 8%. The EFF pushed it to 10%, but the signs are that it will come back to 7-8%. But by and large, in the first election, it was shared between the PAC, Azapo, and so forth. Then Bantu Olomisa came along, he took that 6%. Then Coups came along, they took that 7%. And then the EFF came along and swelled it to 10%. The point is, there are limits on the right and limits on the left, ceilings. And if you put both of them together, 25 plus 10 becomes 35. So the moonshot could be a shot in the dark. The best chance for the ANC, as is proven in the local elections, is that you only have a turnout of around 30% or less.
The best chance for the ANC to be displaced from government,
displaced
yes,
is by turnout and not necessarily. Or even those who don't like President Ramaphosa knows that he's the best chance of staying above 50%. So everyone goes into an election to win. And so maybe your scenario one, that the ANC gets the 50.1% and governs. But coalitions are an insurance policy for when you don't get what you want. And the ANC knows it's in trouble. That's why it's talking the language of coalitions. It feels that it can, but it also feels that it can't. So it brings us to scenario two. And I'm going to be very provocative on this. Scenario two is where the ANC falls under 50%. I call the scenario two the reunification of the RETs. The RET inside the ANC and the RET in the EFF.
we're talking about the people, the cohort who specifically demobilized because they were tied to Jacob Zuma and wanted to hobble the Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency of the ANC and of the country.
I don't think they're going to do that quickly or visibly. I think that there will be enough sanity in order to say, let's win it outright. Let's not take our chances.
But in scenario two, it would be a case of the reunification of those cohorts.
Yes.
What would they coalesce around? Which leader, what program, or is it...
The election will be interpreted as a rejection of sellout politics, moderate politics, business as usual politics, and therefore we need a radical program. We've always wanted to nationalize the Reserve Bank. Now is our job. So that could be the reunification. I'm not too sure about it, but theoretically, it has to be thought. And then there's the third scenario, which is emerging very strongly as the Grand Coalition. So the Grand Coalition means that the two biggest parties run government. They don't have the same ideology, they don't have the same politics, but they have certain objectives that they would share. Now we must go back and say that in the history, for example, where I was in the Western Cape, and it was reflected in the first iteration nationally, we did have a Grand Coalition. In our case, the GPU, the Government of Provincial Unity, nationally the Government of National Unity, it was effectively the ANC and the National Party. And they governed the country in the first 4 years until de Klerk pulled out, and certainly for 4 years in the Western Cape with the ANC under Hernus Kriel as Premier. And so it was an enforced Grand Coalition. And the country was in transition. It needed political stability. It needed to ward off the idea of counter-revolution. And we built a zebra. And even in the way in which Nelson Mandela went about that zebra, he was president, de Klerk is vice president. Trevor Manuel, Minister of Trade and Industry, Derek Keys, Minister of Finance. Because the World Bank, IMF won't call in their loans from a white banker. To keep the mining interest here, Pik Botha for mining. To keep the farmers settled, there was a cry for Niger, maybe, but that was the way in which we built a zebra government for the compelling conditions of 1994 for the first 5 years. So we did have a Grand Coalition at that point. In the Western Cape, there was an anti-ANC coalition that emerged. in the 99 elections. We got 42%. The DP got 10% or 12%, and the National Party got 38%. They combined their votes to keep the ANC out. It lasted 2 years because it was a negative coalition. They knew what they were against. And that was then when we took up an oppositional role that was parliamentary and extra-parliamentary. We didn't have shadow this and shadow that. What we had was organizers. You had to do your spokesperson work against your opponent in that coalition government while you had to mobilize a constituency. We took the anti-racism campaigns to every corner. Where they didn't want to cut black people's hair in Portable, we marched there. Where they had farm workers in court and police stations in Albertinia, we drove there. And so we can go on that we created an enormous pressure cooker for that coalition to collapse. And so that was a short-lived one until it collapsed. And then we put together the ANC-NNP coalition that then went into the election, and we negotiated the portfolios based on who can best deliver to often mutual constituencies. The colored working class, represented by the NNP, and the African working class, represented by the ANC. The colored middle classes, represented by the ANC, with remnants of your Afrikaners who still adhere to the NNP. We shared the rural vote between the ANC and the NNP. But what was dominant in that strain was that we had all the poor under one coalition banner. There were racial tensions, but not class tensions necessarily. And we showed under the banner later of a home for all and Ikapa Eliglumayo, the Cape that we grow and share, we showed the ability of a coalition to deliver to its people until the electorate trusted that coalition again. We brought 46% of the vote. The NNP declined, but still took us to 53%. And then we absorbed them. And then we were able to move forward, and then we effed it up ourselves afterwards when we were on a trajectory. So that's the experience of coalitions. So what I'm saying is, contemporary times must look back and say, we actually had an enforced grand coalition. Secondly, we've seen the fate of anti-coalitions. Keep this one out. We've seen it then with the first iteration of the DA, the DP-NP coalition, and we've seen it in Johannesburg, and we've seen it in Tshwane, and we've seen it in Ekurhuleni, and we've seen it in Port Elizabeth, or in Gqeberha. We've seen it. Negative coalitions collapse under its own weight and create enormous instability. But short of a grand coalition would be a coalition that has minimum shared objectives. Don't agree on everything, but let's agree on shared objectives like we did with the NNP. Overlapping constituencies. They may not be the same color, but they could be the same class. Specific program outcomes, not too many. Minimum program, service delivery on this, that, and the other. Not solve all the problems. And secondly, safety, law enforcement, pushback impunity. You need key informants to it, is social stability, so that we can, secondly, facilitate economic recovery. That we can, thirdly, have political continuity of the middle ground. And finally, restore trust in politics and democracy itself. And then you need to underpin it with a management of differences and disagreements. And in that, you must bring your most respected leadership to the table. Not failed people. And the respect is consistent with the integrity on the one hand and balance. You can't put a loudmouth and an introvert in the same coalition. You then have to have channels of communication, regular meetings. In that situation, initially Peter Maree and I, and then myself and Martinus van Skalkwijk, we would meet twice a week, just problem solving and troubleshooting, checking on the different parts and creating a free space in which he could say, I don't like the way your minister is behaving there. He said something very bad about me there. And then we'd manage it. Because the coalition was more than the collective egos of everybody. And then you've got to have mediation and conflict resolution structures that you can put in place. So that's really the history of coalitions that we come from in the Western Cape. Nothing is new in the space. I think what is added to it is a lot of potential desperation. But it mustn't be about power. The moment you show your greed for power, they've got your number.
Yes.
They know they can horse trade with you. That has been the cunning of a Julius Malema. He smelt the desperation of the DA to be in government, and he had their number.
In 2016.
In 2016.
So I just want to make one last comment and then leave that with you to respond to. I think that I worry a lot about the stability of our institutions and the stability of our country and the unitary concept of South Africa. I see a lot of moves towards balkanization and secession in a way. The conditions of the working class are so precarious that populism and unguided revolution, in a way, which would destroy everything, every institution that binds our society together. The coalitions, if a coalition comes, or even if the ANC wins electoral power or goes over 50%, there has to be some kind of regard for, I would say, staving off some kind of anarchy. That would. There's a lot of legitimate grievances out there, especially among an impoverished working class, high unemployment. So whatever comes, whether it be a coalition or the ANC ruling nationally with scraping just over 50%, it has to be equipped to really deal with some of the structural issues that we've been effectively carrying and burying, and these landmines, as you put it, that have been left unintended and unexploded since the democratic breakthrough, even before then, even as a legacy of colonialism. I'll leave you with the final word.
Look, the greatest thing we have going for us is that our constitution has weathered the storm. It has left us institutions which are shaken but not broken. The judiciary has stepped into the breach to give landmark rulings that protected our democracy, our human rights, and our freedom. And the judiciary had to become activist. The media became investigative. We may not always agree with them, we may not always like them, but there has been enough of an investigative instinct that have uncovered stuff and not hidden stuff. Civil society has become really active. It's a machine gun. It shoots wherever it is, but the fact is that it instills enough fear for wrongdoers. And our people, at crucial times, have stepped into the breach. So, And then we've had government institutions like Treasury that had the courage to withstand an imposed minister and made him a weekend special. And so all in all, what the Mandela Tambo generation left us was a durable, resilient constitution that protected us through difficult, stormy times. As I said, we are shaken, but we have had losses. In some cases, the dismantling of the security, legal, prosecutorial establishment. It took us a while to understand that the Sean Abrams was going to lose files, that the Mkhwebane was going to chuck out Vrede, that they were embedded in the system. And so, by and large, there are aberrations, but the system is still working. There's been enormous suffering. I mean, the thing that stands between South Africa and anarchy, I explained to the National Endowment for Democracy delegation that was here last weekend.
Oh, my good friends.
Yep. I explained to them that what stands between South Africa and daily riots is the fact that every month 23 million people queue for a safety net, a bailout. If you're old, you get a pension. If you're disabled, you get a grant. If you're under 18, you get a support. If you this, that, and the other. And now you've even got a distress grant. That helps. And that invests people in the system. And so many of my lighter-skinned friends say, why are blacks so stupid? They're not. They know that this system gives them something that they would never, ever have gotten. And they're invested in it. And so for me, we have that safety net, but that ought to be for the unemployable, because you're too old and because you're disabled and because you're too young. But it cannot be the panacea, the band-aid for most of the 32% unemployed. We need different solutions. And I think that that brings us back to our place in the globe, our place in Africa, because we're living in an integrated world. South Africa has the wherewithal to be the driver of the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution in Africa. But it means that we've got to make choices and trade-offs. And we mustn't get it wrong. So we are putting free education at the end of the conveyor belt at universities. And that's good for the students who get it. But we are not starting off. Take that 40 billion, put it into ECD. Follow that to primary school. Follow those children to high school. Then follow them to university. Because all along the way, you have funded them to get the requisite literacy, numeracy, and the ability to reason, to do math, and to do all of those kind of things, so that when they are at university level, they choose a subject and a course of work that feeds into the needs of the fourth industrial. We have got it wrong from sheer populism. We put 40 billion at the end of the conveyor belt and neglected the front end of that conveyor belt. And so we can go on with a number of policy choices that we may have made that have not enabled us to reach those kind of objectives.
Ebrahim Rasool, I think there was a comment. So let's Rasool in your studio with a Jewish name, board member, I believe them. whatever. Mike from Newlands, you know. I'll ask him what they... And I think there was another comment that said, no, it's fine, you guys can go for another 90 minutes. No, Sean, no, you guys can go for... I think that's fine. One more question. Who's going to win the Rugby World Cup?
I fear it's not South Africa.
Why not?
I'm not convinced. I want it. That's my emotional decision. I don't think we have had convincing performances so far. The All Blacks look really good. They look really good. I'm not discounting France and Ireland. I'd love it to be South Africa. I hope I'm wrong. But I've been rational with you all evening. So on a rugby question, let me continue to be rational. I fear for South Africa.
I don't know. The New Zealand thing is seems about nailing it in the dress rehearsals, but maybe coming short, peaking too soon. We're not peaking too soon, at least as the Springboks. So at least there's that. But
I think we peaked against Australia.
That was a great match, yeah, but hopefully not. Ambassador,
Inshallah.
Premier, comrade. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Nantal, thank you so much for co-piloting an awesome show. We back next Monday. I guess taxi permitting, I suppose. That's the reality that we have to live. Yeah. So wherever you are, take care of your loved ones, travel safely, be safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much.